Welcome to Let's Grow Buffalo.
Where today we're talking about the mother of all vegetable garden plants, the tomato. So one of the most important questions you have to ask yourself is, what do you want to use these tomatoes for?
Yeah, there's a lot of different varieties of tomatoes out there, so there are some things to consider. They come in all different colors, shapes, sizes, flavors even. But there's three main categories, I would say, for tomatoes. Starting with your slicer tomatoes, for example, like a beefsteak tomato, something you put on a sandwich that's a larger tomato. You also have paste tomatoes, like Romas and San Marzanos. Those are more your tomatoes for making sauce, something that you're hopefully going to store. And then third, you have your like salad tomatoes, like a cherry or a grape tomato, which have a variety of uses.
Yeah. So yeah, last year I made a mistake. I went to the store and I'm like, ooh, tomatoes, these look delicious. I don't love tomatoes themselves, but everything tomato based I do. So I was planning on making salsa and spaghetti sauce, and I was down and ready to go for that. Got them in the ground, planted them, and when I actually started making the sauce, it ended up being too watery. The slicer tomato that I actually had bought contains more water than it does actual meat. So what I should have done, and what I'm going to do this year, is actually invest more in a Roma style tomato. So that'll help me get the results that I'm looking for. Now, the more complicated question that I have for you, Justin, is can you explain an indeterminate versus a determinate variety?
Yeah, so they have very different growth habits. So an indeterminate tomato typically has a vining habit. It needs a little bit more support. Typically, you'll want like some kind of trellis or a stake of some sort. A couple years ago, I did stakes for my tomato plants, and that worked pretty well. It required a little bit of time to tie the tomatoes to the stakes as they grew, but it worked out well. And then to save time, though, as I wanted to have a little bit more production, I moved to a trellis system that's takes up a lot of space. I can grow a lot of tomatoes, and it's a lot less work. They'll just kind of grow up in the netting and kind of take care of themselves.
Gotcha. Okay, so based on what you're explaining, it sounds like I did not have an experience like that last year, which means that everything that I was growing was a determinate. So in my experience, they ended up growing more like a bush. They were kind of contained in a small space. They didn't try and spread their way around the garden. They ended up getting a few feet tall, maybe 3 feet at their height. The nice thing about the ones that I had was that they tended to mature around the same time. So especially this year, if I'm trying to grow Romas and try and do a batch of sauce, most of them should mature in a 1 to 2 week period around each other. And some of those that don't, if they at least start to turn color, they're still green, but maybe they have a little bit of yellow starting on them. You can still pick those, and they'll continue to ripen off the vine. They don't need the plant anymore at that point. So you can always do that and hopefully get to the tomato before some pest does.
So one of the other differences with an indeterminate tomato variety is that they'll produce fruit pretty early in the season, and then they'll continually produce as they grow. So you'll get some tomatoes early as the first fruiting stems will appear on the plants, and then maybe you'll get to harvest those and eat those, while other ones are just starting to flower or just starting to form into green tomatoes, and you should get a nice harvest throughout the season.
Nice. All right, so let's start out here. This is a seed starting tray that I bought. It's a 72 cell setup that I have. It came with these little coconut core dehydrated cells. So essentially what you do with this is you add some water to it, it blows up, it fills the cell. Now, I did not use these for these trays that I'm going to put my tomatoes in, or these cells that I'm going to put my tomatoes in. The thing that I don't love about these coconut based ones is that there's no actual nutrition. So what I actually have is a Miracle Grow seed starting potting mix. So essentially that is a growing medium, as well as it has a little bit of fertilizer in it, so I can keep my plants there a little longer. You probably can barely even see it, but in my hand is a single tomato seed. So this seed actually contains everything that it needs, including the energy, to get to its first stage of life. So essentially one of these. This is a different plant. These are pepper plants here. This is probably the most similar to what you'll find. So essentially that seed gets wet in the soil. It starts to open up when it gets enough heat and after enough time has passed. And it grows two set of false leaves. And then eventually as the plant continues to grow, these leaves fall off and it gains its true leaves. So the soil that I have in these cells has a little bit of that nutrition that'll help get it to that point. And eventually, once the plant grows too big for the cell, you don't want the roots to get bound up, so you're going to want to pot it up to a bigger pot. But anyway, the mix that I have in here has been pre-moistened. It's like a wrung out sponge. It's not soaking, but it'll be enough to get this thing going. So as I start planting these tomato seeds, Justin's going to talk to you a little bit about some other stuff you need to know.
Yeah, so tomatoes are a warm weather plant, so they're not going to be able to tolerate any frost at all. They prefer warmth. They grow better in a warmer climate with a long growing season. So one of our complications here in Zone 6A is that we really don't have a long enough season to grow a tomato from seed in the garden. So you either have to buy plants that are already grown in a nursery, or you want to start your seeds ahead of time indoors like Jake's doing right now. You sort of want to base when you do this on your last frost date, at least the average or predicted last frost date in your area. For me, I had a couple different resources I looked into. I saw things like the 24th of April, the 30th of April, and even the 17th of May. So to try to play it safe, I based my planting schedule around an average last frost date of May 17th.
Yeah, essentially that's going to be a lower risk for you. So the weatherman can only predict so many days in advance, and with Buffalo weather, this fine day in March is 70 degrees, and we're 2 days away from being buried under a foot of snow. So
yeah, so especially with something that you're putting a lot of time and effort into, you really don't want to risk it, so I try to play it safe. And even then, if I'm thinking about planting mid to late May, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on the weather. But in my case, at least last year, I started my seeds on the 16th of March, and then for about 4 or 5 weeks I left them in their original cell tray. I do things a little differently than Jake. I use a sterile seed starting mix for my plants when I start them. So after about 4 to 5 weeks, I pot them up into a different mixture that I make that includes a soluble nitrogen fertilizer. And once I do that, they have the extra nutrition they need to continue to grow in their own larger pots. And then by May 24th was when I planted my tomatoes outside, and everything went well.
Nice. So I'm finishing up here. I started off filling these cells about 80% of the way, and then I just plopped the seed down on top. I made sure, actually before I even planted the seed, I made sure to pack the dirt in somewhat. I didn't pack it in super tight. I didn't want it squishing out of the holes in the bottom, but I packed it in enough that it's not just going to all sink down and depress to half the size. And then I plopped the seed down, and I'm just covering it up with another top layer of soil here. And one more little scoop. Everything's nice and flush. Got some pretty looking seeds here. And yeah, I'm hoping when I get home I'll be able to keep these moist. Maybe put the hood back on top to retain some of the moisture, the humidity dome, and put it on a heating mat so it stays at the temperature it needs to germinate at.
Yeah, and since these are pretty small seeds, tomatoes in general, it's you want to plant them pretty shallow so you get a good germination. But one of the cool things about tomato plants is when you pot them up like I do in 4 or 5 weeks, you can plant them very deep in the soil and basically bury the majority of the stem, and that area of the stem that's underground will then produce roots.
Yeah, eventually once you actually start to see a sizable tomato seedling, you'll see little fuzzes on there. Those are almost like a stem cell, so they could potentially grow into roots. You can rip off a couple of leaves and bury most of the thing if you really want to, and eventually that turns into roots, so you could potentially have a more stable plant. But we'll maybe talk about that at a later date. You don't need to worry about that right now. So as always, the best thing you can do to help the channel is like, comment, subscribe. Let us know in the comments, what are you growing? What kind of troubleshooting questions do you have? And you can always share this with your friends and help us grow. So as always, gardening is a practice, and let's grow buffalo.